Unable to play national unifier in the wake of last weekend's shootings, President Trump reverted to the role of victim. Instead of commanding moral leadership, he ended the week as the country's sore loser. And during his visits to Dayton and El Paso, the president even managed to inflame political divisions rather than heal them. Well, as the New York Times describes it, it was a day intended as a show of compassion to cities scarred by a weekend of violence, but which quickly devolved into an occasion for anger-fueled broadsides. Despite his promise to remain above the fray this week, the president couldn't resist issuing more than 10 attacks against his critics, lashing out against Democratic office holders, presidential candidates, and local officials, as well as, of course, the media. As hundreds of demonstrators made clear that Trump was not welcome in El Paso, some of the victims in the hospital declined to see the president while he was there. The Washington Post reports that, according to a hospital spokesperson, none of the 8 victims of the El Paso mass shooting still being treated at the University Medical Center agreed to meet with President Trump when he visited. Furthermore, as Trump met with the hospital's medical staff, he bragged about the size of his recent rally and attacked El Paso's former Congressman Beto O'Rourke. And even though the White House press corps was kept at bay, a local CBS affiliate in Texas managed to obtain a video of the president during that meeting.
I was here 3 months ago. We made a speech, and we had what was the name of the arena? That place was packed, right? That was some crowd.
Thank you.
And we had twice the number outside. And then you had this crazy Beto. Beto had like 400 people in a parking lot. They said his crowd was wonderful.
And he's in that hospital meeting with the victims of the tragedy, using that quality time to attack Beto O'Rourke, the local congressman. And when asked about why the press was kept away from the president during his hospital visits, the White House press secretary said the visit was never intended to be a photo op. Yet Trump's aides still held a photo op of their own, and by the end of the day had released three highlight videos. The president, well, the Washington Post also reveals that 2 White House officials said there were concerns that the press could capture an impolitic moment of the president making an insensitive comment. These are staff guys working for the president of the United States who trash him by saying he's like a big dog you got to keep off the lawn. In some, the trip was generally seen as not ideal, they said. In the words of one senior administration official, 4 others described the trip in similar terms. I'm joined now by Ashley Parker, Washington Post White House reporter. Joel Payne is a Democratic strategist. Anthony Scaramucci is the president's former White House communications director. Hey, Mooch, Mr. Scaramucci, why do people continue to work for this president who talk about him in such embarrassing ways? They don't show any respect for him. They say basically he will poop on the couch if you let him in there, and they still work there.
Well, I mean, doesn't that speak to some
people?
Well, you tell me, though. You live in that place. I only could last 11 days. That speaks well of those people, that they can't put their names on something and speak honestly about something. That speaks well of them, that they can't take a number and get into the Oval Office and look directly at the commander-in-chief and say, hey, this isn't working. Here are the 5 reasons why it's not working. Something about Washington where there's an allergic reaction to the truth, and people would rather tell the reporter on an anonymous phone call about what they think is going on in an attempt that they think actually saves their face. So look, the president didn't do well on the trip. He'd probably be mad at somebody for saying that. Maybe he'll tweet something negative about somebody for saying that he didn't do well on the trip. But the facts are he did not do well on the trip, because if the trip is being made about him and not the demonstration of compassion and love and caring and empathy for those people, then it becomes a catastrophe for him, the administration, and it's also a bad reflection on the country. But those people inside the White House are a bunch of cowards. They should tell the guy the truth instead of picking up the phone and calling a reporter.
Actually, along those lines, I know you use these people as sources. I'll ask you another question altogether differently. Can this president distinguish between the time to fight and the time to be a leader of a truce? It seemed like this was a week for a truce, to go into the hospital rooms, and if you can get in there, talk with the victims about their lives, talk to their family members, the victims' families, and not use it as a time to keep spitballing people like Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke is not his leading competitor. There's no reason to take these shots at him. Why do you do it?
Well, this is a president who prides himself on being a counterpuncher. And when you pride yourself on being a counterpuncher, it means you view the world through the lens of there is never not a time to fight. And that's what was so striking. I was on that trip with him yesterday, and he went into it, him and his staff, saying this was a time for healing and unity. And it was a time for those things. But then he sort of couldn't resist taking political digs and going after anyone who he felt had slighted him. And that included yesterday Vice President Biden, Senator Sherrod Brown, the Dayton mayor, and members of the media, and he just cannot resist.
It seemed to me, though, he was really overzealous with the counterpunching with Sherrod Brown and the mayor there of Dayton, because they were relatively non-political. Why do you think he swiped back at them so hard?
You're right. Their comments were actually somewhat neutral to positive, because they said, look, he came here, he did the right things, he said the right things, he comforted the people. But again, if you listen to his words and you looked at the videos that the White House put out, the president, as his social media director said in a tweet, wanted to be treated like a quote unquote rock star. He was talking about all the love and the adulation, and I think he was frustrated, and you heard that in his public comments, that they sort of weren't as adoring and appreciative of his visits as he would have liked them to have been.
Well, let me go to Joel. Here's the question, because, we've even in movies like Dave, they talk about a regular guy being president, sort of pretending to be president. You're pretty good if you're a human being. It just sort of, families lost people's lives. The relatives are dead. Kids don't have parents. Okay. They're Hispanic people. They're Latino people. You've had a war of the issue of immigration, but not against them individually. Why can't he just do that?
Well, I think we know this president is anything but a regular person. He's not. He doesn't have a sense of humor. He doesn't have empathy. He doesn't have impulse control, Chris. I mean, these aren't even characteristics we look for presidents. These are characteristics we look for in friends and neighbors, and he doesn't have them.
By the way, you're very observant. He doesn't really have a sense of humor.
He really doesn't, and which is kind of a dangerous quality in a leader. Can I posit something radical here? Is it possible that this president is kind of floundering around on this trip because Democrats and the left and progressives have kind of won the culture war on guns, and this president doesn't know what to do? The Washington Post has some great reporting about the fact that the NRA has kind of put the president up against the wall, pressuring him not to do anything on background checks. It's a 90% issue in favor of doing something, even 54% were Republicans. Could I suggest that maybe part of what we're seeing is a president who doesn't have an exit plan?
To get out of this one?
Yeah, to get out of this one. He doesn't know what to do because he knows he's got to do something, but the moneyed interest behind him won't let him do it. And he has no way out.
Well, let me go to Scaramuccia on that. Anthony, what is the story on this guy? Because he seems like he's playing an old trick. The old trick last time when we had the last shooting was to say, while the heat was on, say something. And when the heat is off, do nothing. It always works because the anti-gun people or the gun control or gun safety people, they keep their interest up for a week or two, maybe 10 days, and they're all into something else, climate change, whatever else. Whereas the gun people are still around. The NRA is still around, still watching to see if there's any give. So he says all the right stuff when the heat's on. We're going to do something about background checks. But this time, it looks like even Mitch McConnell feels they're caught here. They got to do something in 3 or 4 weeks when they do come back. I'm not sure that's true. They could play this game again like Lucy in the football. They can say we're going to do it and then they drop the football again.
I think it's tough for them to do something because the calculation that they're making is they need 100% of the base, and they're fearful that if they do something related to the guns. Right now, the status quo, unfortunately, 200-plus incidents, the status quo seems to be okay. They waited out for the next crisis. But the truth of the matter is something will happen after the 2020 election because the NRA has basically been gutted. And so follow the money in Washington. They don't have the money that they used to have. And so therefore, they don't have the power. And if the polling is as bad as it actually is on the gun issue, without the money behind the NRA anymore, Chris, they'll end up flip-flopping and going in another direction away from the NRA. But I think the chances of them doing that before the 2020 presidential election are low because they're making a calculation. Just look at the political strategy that they need every single person in that base lined up like they were in 2016.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.